This is the second audio recording for the opening post of week 5. Week 5 is on ethics, and week 6 is on ethics as well. If you take a look at the article by Brenda Green, it can be quite dense. It's a good example of why you shouldn't try to say everything, because then it's really hard to kind of get the key points out of it. But I partly chose this article because Dr. Green is a Canadian psychiatric nursing scholar. She graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Mental Health from Brand University. And that is equivalent to a Bachelor of Science in Psychiatric Nursing. Historically, the first degree program that was started at Brandon or in Canada was a post-diploma degree, and the RPNs of the province decided to call it a Bachelor of Science in Mental Health Nursing. But when they made a Bachelor of Science degree that you start from the word go, there was a survey that went out, and the membership decided to call it a Bachelor of Science in Psychiatric Nursing. Anyways, all there is now is a Bachelor of Science in Psychiatric Nursing. We don't have any more diploma level psychiatric nurses coming through to get a Bachelor of Science in Mental Health. Anyways, Dr. Green went on to get a Master's of Science in Community Health and Epidemiology and a PhD in Interdisciplinary Studies. Now, I have been interested in the ethics of care and whether that is a useful ethical theory when you consider relationship as an organizing principle in psychiatric nursing. So all the readings and my writings this week have been a bit of a meditation on which ethical theory kind of makes the most sense to me as being philosophically consistent with relationship as a organizing principle in psychiatric nursing. And I'll talk a little bit at the end about where I'm at with that right now. To give you some background, Carol Gilligan's a psychologist, and she developed this ethics of care, which has been taken up as a feasible theory of ethics for nursing. Certainly not the theory of ethics for nursing, but it has been very seriously considered. She was a research assistant of a psychologist named Kohlberg, and she reacted to Kohlberg's work on levels of moral reasoning. What Kohlberg did was he studied the development of adolescent boys in order to produce an ethical theory on human moral reasoning. At that time, it was not unusual to generalize research to women when the research only used male participants. Much of the early research on cardiac health was done all on men, and then it was just assumed that it applied to women as well. There's lots of examples of that, actually. Now, ethical philosophies have been heavily influenced by masculine ways of understanding the world. For instance, a focus on autonomy and justice. And of course, part of this is because most philosophers have been men. Gilligan proposed a feminist ethic which emphasizes interpersonal relationships, the needs of others, and the role of caring. So that questions of what is good or right ethical or moral, are determined within the context of relationships and people's lives. Caring is a really important concept, but complex concept within nursing. The meanings of care and of the meanings of acts of caring are influenced by historical, gendered, social, and political factors. The goal of critique is to recognize and challenge unexamined assumptions about caring and the acts of care and the acts of caring, and to examine relationships of power within and impacting on acts of caring. So, for instance, important ethical questions for nurses today include: what are the conditions necessary for caring within nursing practice? And are the basics of those conditions prioritized within healthcare settings? Nursing practice is dependent on professional relationships and political factors for supportive practice environments. Nurses tend to work in environments heavily biased towards logical, abstract reasoning, so that it's difficult to make the case for situated and conditioned reasoning, which is necessary for attending to complex, individualized needs, especially relationship needs. And the article I'm referencing here is Isaacs et al., 2009. Caring is strongly associated with the attributes of compassion, empathy, nurturance, and kindness. Society identifies these attributes with women and their expected roles as mothers and caregivers. Now, this does not mean that men do not have nor aspire to these attributes. We're talking about a socially constructed dichotomy of maleness and femaleness. What are the consequences of valuing what are considered masculine attributes over what are considered feminine attributes? Nursing is a gendered issue. So why is it, for instance, that nursing became one of the first professions made available to women, and until very recently was considered a female profession, with some exceptions. And so our profession in our practice is influenced by those gendered and historical factors. Now, ethics of care means that ethical determinations are not grounded in abstract principles, such as autonomy of the individual, but are grounded in the relationships and the responsibilities of everyday life. Relationships between people. You could say lived experience. Western ideals about individualism ignore the embedded nature of each person within complex webs of relationships. It prioritizes individual autonomy over collectivist needs and priorities. Western ideals about individualism assumes everyone has the capacity for free and informed decisions and actions. It assumes everybody has equal capacity for free and informed decisions and actions. So, Green brings up and something called relational autonomy. She references Christensen for this. Relational autonomy is an alternative concept of autonomy. In relational autonomy, the individual is a self-governing agent, but one that is a product of social relationships, and someone who defines their value commitments in terms of interpersonal relationships and mutual dependencies. So relational autonomy is situated conditions on autonomy. Relational views of the autonomous person do not eliminate commitment to justice, but relational views consider the social power dynamics that restrict autonomy for some and facilitate the autonomy of others within society at large or within particular types of relationships, such as a mental health service. The principle of individual autonomy is dependent on the ability to make free, informed decisions. Right? We talk about it all the time. Free, informed consent. Within mental health systems, I'm sorry about the dog. Free, informed consent and individual decision-making capacity is constrained. It's problematic. In mental health systems, an individual's liberty and agency is often constrained by illness, by risk of harm, and by institutional priorities. There is an inherent conflict between aspirations for equitable, collaborative power relationships and concerns about competence and risk. It's not a simple matter. It's very complex. And so we need some guidelines about how to make those decisions. And because of the paternalistic nature of mental health care, we need to really examine some things we take as self-evident and some unexamined assumptions. Roberts, well, he doesn't really come up with any conclusions, but he writes very clearly. And I find him very easy to understand, and he comes from a psychiatric nursing perspective. Paternalism, according to Roberts, 2004, is linked to what we consider masculine ways of understanding healthcare. Paternalism is at the root of a number of ethical issues in psychiatry. Pearsall defines paternalism as policies and practices of people in positions of authority used to restrict freedom and responsibilities of less powerful, more dependent others. I'll say that again. I think I kind of messed it up. Paternalism involves policies and practices of people in positions of authority. They use those policies and practices to restrict the freedom and responsibilities of less powerful and more dependent others. I was taught that caring for the mentally ill meant taking responsibility for them, from them, while they were ill, and gradually returning responsibility to them when they recovered. That was common rhetoric. In my career, I've witnessed the hard work of disempowerment, but I did not often witness empowerment. The principles of autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice are complicated by the assumptions and habits of paternalism, and by the nature of many mental illnesses. How do we respond to the dilemmas of paternalism? Because they're very real, it's a problem. When there are issues of competency and risk. Now, those issues of competency and risk are sometimes uncritically assumed, and they are sometimes very real. Roberts states that the ethical responsibility of psychiatric nurses is, quote, engaged involvement with clients, I've replaced the word to be clients, needs, rather than a detached consideration of general principles. Engaged involvement with clients' needs rather than a detached consideration of general principles. Roberts introduces the idea of virtue ethics. He doesn't make it up. I mean, he introduces it in his article. Virtue ethics emphasizes the moral characteristics of the individual as a means for determining what is ethical or moral actions. Virtue ethics are commonly used in psychiatric nursing, although not necessarily thought of as such. A psychiatric nurse should be empathetic, right? Compassionate, self-aware, respectful, caring, trustworthy, and committed. We are taught the virtues valued by our society and the virtues valued by our profession. There is a social ideal about what constitutes a good person, and there are social ideals about what constitutes a good psychiatric nurse. So that we can, if we are properly socialized characters, then we rely upon the virtues we have incorporated to make ethical decisions. Robert refers to communitarianism as the collective from which we derive our ideas about proper virtues. Virtue ethics assumes that a properly virtuous person will make the right ethical decision based upon the principle they have incorporated into their sense of self. And Robert is also pointing to the processes whereby communities collectively decide what those virtues are, what is a good character for a psychiatric nurse. I want to bring in an idea here from Robertson and Walter called the golden mean. I'd heard it before, but I didn't know what it meant. So the term comes from Aristotle, and it has to do with using virtue ethics, which the Greeks were really big on. Ethical decisions require finding the middle ground when applying ethical principles. So, this holds true for biomedical ethics, autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, justice, etc. The example given by Robertson and Walter for a golden mean is finding a happy medium somewhere between overly lenient justice and harsh, inflexible justice. It is the individual who must have practical wisdom or phronesis to find the golden mean in making ethical decisions. So, virtue ethics and principalism are dependent on the virtuous characteristics and the practical wisdom of the individual. Now, I want to go back to the ethics of care and my discussion about that. Oh, right. I propose combining a feminist ethics of care because of its attention to relationship, to positionality, to standpoint, um, to mutual dependency. So I propose combining feminine ethics of care with traditional principles of biomedical ethics in order to contextualize ethical decision making within the mutual responsibilities of relationships and taking into account contextual factors such as unequal relations of power. So I don't have a problem with principalism and the biomedical ethics. I think we do need to make collective decisions about what are desirable principles. But I think that ethics of care gives us the flexibility to weigh those principles against each other and against the specific circumstances of the relationships that we're involved in and the needs of the people we're working with. So ethics of care solves some of the problems of principalism. So principalism is critiqued to be vague. Well, ethics of care is very specific within particular contexts and relationships. It's not possible to be specific at the level of general decontextualized principles. They have to be contextualized in order to be ethically right for the people they're applied to, the situations they're applied in. I'll just put that up there big. Principalism is also criticized for being detached from the milieu of decision making, but ethics of care, by definition, really is situated right within the muck and mire of decision making circumstances and realities. Now, principalism can imply that there's such a thing as a perfect case for autonomy, for beneficence, that there is some ideal, a principle to which we can achieve. But ethics of care deals with the messiness and the imperfection of ethics in real life situations. Principalism is critiqued because how do we rank the principles? Well, in ethics of care, decisions about balancing principles are made through considerations of specific responsibilities to people, specific needs of people, and specific situations. Principalism has been accused of being a detached reasoning, an abstract, objective, detached reasoning. Principalism has been assumed to be objective reasoning, which harkens back to Haraway, Donna Haraway. She would call that a God trick. The God trick of dominating from a position of, a God trick of dominating, oh dear me, the God trick of dominating everyone, from a position of nowhere. So Haraway critiqued this idea of objectivity. There's no such thing as this objective space. Ethics of care are ethics of positionality. Ethics of care is a recognition of standpoint. It's a partial objectivity. It's a situated ethics. Ethics of care can be used to combine subjectivity with reason. So we can combine the importance of the subject, about whom the decisions are being made, with reason, traditions of inquiry in principles. And then I think I'll just leave it at that, and see what you have to say about these ethical theories and how they might make sense in practice for you. Thanks.